What about your education more broadly? I mean, thinkers who influenced you. I know you discuss in the book, I think you mentioned particularly Thomas Sowell, who, well, thank God, is still alive and well and writing at age, I don't know, 86.
Yeah.
Really a wonderful economist, but more than an economist. Say a word about him if you want,
You
or
know,
about others. I don't want to,
Well, I actually I think that the people in my life who required me to look for actual facts and reason and truth have a lot to do with my development. People like my grandparents. My granddad, he had this one saying that I always loved it. He said, "Boy, if it don't make no sense, it's because it don't make no sense." And so you're always trying to make sense of things, and you look around you and you see that there were so many things that didn't make sense. And when you ask people for explanations, for example, when I was in law school, tell people to explain a social policy, and they would tell me, for example, you should believe that because you're black. Well, that's a non-starter with me. That's like people would say when I was in college, like, what kind of music you listen to. I said, well, they said you should listen to jazz, or maybe Hugh Masekela or something like that. I said, why? Because you're black. Well, I'm not going to do that. That's like in the South. You have to be in this park, go to that school because you're black. I'm not doing that. So I started listening to other music, like classical or country or whatever. Now what am I? But Tom Sowell was a guy who I ran into when I was in law school, when he wrote a book called Black Education Myths and Tragedies. And that I thought, no, well, that the black guy can't think that way. So I tossed it. Some years later, in the mid-1970s, 1976 or so, I was in Jefferson City, Missouri, and ran across his book, a review of his book by Michael Novak in the Wall Street Journal, of Tom Sowell's book, Race and Economics. And a friend of mine who since passed away brought it to my attention. I said, I'll be dang. This guy is pointing out something that makes sense on race and education, et cetera. So I found Race and Economics and read it. I mean, literally gobbled it down,
Wow.
or wolfed it down, whichever way you want to put it. And I said, finally, it makes sense.
But you'd never met Tom
I'd
Sowell
never
at
met
this
him,
point.
and it would be 1978 after I moved to St. Louis that I met him.
Uh-huh.
And I went over to, someone showed me a brochure where he was appearing at Washington University Law School. And so I'd go over in my little cheap suit, and he's debating one Professor Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Is that right?
Yeah, and so I go over and I'm going to get my book signed, and as a groupie, and I listen to the debate, and he signs my book and looks at me like, whoa, because there weren't that many people there, but I was there, I'm enthusiastic. Another person on that program who was not on that particular panel was one Professor Antonin Scalia. And I just thought that was fascinating. That was 1978 at Washington University. That's the first time I met him. And it would be in the 1980 or so when I was in Washington that I would meet him again, and we became friends.
That's great. His work is very much worth reading, and some of it's on race, but a lot of it isn't really.
A lot of different things.
A lot of different
Say's
things.
law, et cetera.
Yeah, real importance.
And a lot of cultural things. But, I would say in high school, there were these wonderful people. There were the people at the library. There were these ladies at a little bookstore. There were people at Savannah Public Library and the Carnegie Library. And the nuns who introduced me to different things. Father Cuddy, who was my English teacher in the seminary, high school seminary. Every 6 weeks, you were required to do a book report, independent of your other work. So you'd read books like Fail Safe, and book that was popular back then.
Right.
And there were other books that you would, but it had to be something serious, and he had to approve it. So I started sort of reading more serious things, not just sports books and comic books and things like that. And so you eventually, with these wonderful ladies, God, there's people who have been so good to me. There are these wonderful people who introduced me to books like Richard Wright or Ralph Ellison. Richard Wright was popular back then, but there were the angry novels, The Native Son, Black Boy, Outsider. Then you had Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. So they were race related. So of course I was fascinated by these. and how complicated it was, particularly with Ralph Ellison, as you wrestle with all these things, sort of like these stereotypes and who you really are. Then they introduced me. I'm a kid. I'm like 16, 17 years old. They introduced me to Ayn Rand. So and then right? I wound up reading like Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, etc. And I would continue reading them from time to time throughout the rest of my life. So then you start think about why I would in Georgia be interested in sort of libertarian ideologies. You see the sort of the rules that the state imposes on you because of race or because of this or because of that, and you can't do anything about it. So as libertarians, well, I don't want that. I mean, you want less of that or none of that. And it was very attractive. But I started reading those things. So all these ideas take seed, and then you take philosophy, and I was, you took a lot of the nihilists and things like that. In college, I wasn't all that interested in them. So, but it's just, again, those were just people. And then, I read, later in life, I read, for example, your mother. I mean, the Victorian virtues, Jewish virtues, I think it was, a piece that she had written. And I'd see those sorts of things, the ideals appealed to me. So I would read, voraciously. And it would be later on that idea that this love that you should learn, you're required to learn, you're required to go to the front of the train. When I was at EEOC, and when I hired those Straussians to work with me, Ken and Masugi and John Marini. And so we started reading more of this stuff and started discussing it more and going to the Political Science Association meetings. But the idea was to find the ideas, to think about them. And as my grandfather says, the other side of what he said was to make sense of these things. Why this government? Why this form of government? Why not just this policy, but why? Why us? The larger questions, and to try to answer them.
I'm curious, is there one or two novelists or philosophers or essayists that you come back to the most, or that you sort of, particularly treasure? You've read very widely and at different stages in your life, different types of literature, essays, or biographies.
I come back to Kill a Mockingbird.
Is that right?
Come back to that one.
Did you read that as a young man?
Yeah.
In the South?
And went to the movie. And it was particularly poignant in the 1960s.
Yeah.
So we all, in some extent, became Gregory Peck.
Right.
And it was probably why I even thought of law, because it was all I knew about law. And I'd come back to Native Son and to Invisible Man.
The Invisible Man is just I looked at it. I should reread the whole thing. I looked at it for some reason a few years ago. I think we had something in the Weekly Standard maybe about Ellison. That's an amazing book, which I don't think is read nearly as much as it should be these days.
Because it doesn't play into the narratives now. We are a world of narratives.
Right.
And what he was wrestling with was precisely that, where we've created these stereotypes and they interact with each other. I'm supposed to have a stereotype of you of me.
Right.
And then the individuals are over here. And I think it's important to dig through all of that stuff. And I started wrestling with that in high school, the individual, versus, and then, of course, with Ayn Rand, the individual versus the collective. But there were also the individual versus the stereotypes.
Right.
And there's stereotypes in lots of ways. We have them today. That if you're black, you're supposed to do this or do that. And also it's fascinating. We're creative with our sameness. So, we all are supposed to look a certain way, and that's individuality. But we all look the same. We're doing the same things. And these were things that were going on back in the 60s. You define yourself. You're black. You must have an afro, so I refuse to have one, so what am I?
Right.
I refuse to, I prefer to be me. Well, you can't be because you're black, And so I think Ralph Ellison got it, so I come back to that.
Yeah.
But there are other things. I read widely. I try to read books that people say they've read.
Any of the founders or earlier justices who particularly you admire, you would recommend to a young person, if they said, who should I read a biography of? I went through college. No one ever assigned any biographies, because that's not what they do anymore, right? They
Yeah.
read, God knows what they read, social history and
Yeah,
all this, whatever. But what would you say? I mean, who do
You know, I don't. I think to be honest with you, I think if they just read, I tried to read things that I was interested in at that time, and then to stretch myself some, and to read about things I was interested in. If I had a question about Reconstruction, and I read what's his name? He's more of a revisionist historian up at Columbia, but he wrote a book on Reconstruction. And I may not agree with him on two things, but it's a very interesting book on Reconstruction. So I just finished a history of the English by this guy Robert Toombs, and that's pretty long. Or you start reading books that people say they've read that they haven't read, like The Wealth of Nations.
Yeah.
How many people actually have read that? Or Human Action by von Mies. I mean, people say, well, they just, they've read like a cliff note or something. But I think we're obligated to read these things, to think about them. But for young people, I say just read.
Yeah, that's
and
good.
Not just sort of current events, but to push yourself. I tend to like the classical things. I think if I could encourage them to put one paperback on their desk and read it occasionally without getting into too deep about things personally, it would be Hillsdale's Constitutional Reader,
Right.
from Hillsdale College, because it's one book, and it has a lot of the founding documents. It has the Constitution, the Declaration. It's got it all in one place. And it has the progressives who
Right.
disagree, some of the criticisms. And if you just did that, you would be one of the better informed people in the country. If you had to watch, even if you don't read, I still think, for me, that John Adams series was important. I mean, the book would be great if they read it, but I understand I'm being sort of realistic. I think that series was really quite good. Or any of the Civil War stuff. I think the Civil War is pivotal in our country, on race and the post-Civil War, Reconstruction. All of it's really important. And Jim McPherson wrote a really good book that was influential back in the 80s, A Battle Cry of Freedom. I think
Yeah, I
he's
remember
retired
that.
now.
I think
Just
so.
really, it's a one-volume series on Civil War. I happen to be a big Churchill fan because I didn't understand why the rest of the world allowed Hitler to goose step across the world. I just thought that was wrong. Evil is evil. And that's how I discovered Churchill back in the 1980s. And I'm a big fan of Churchill
Yeah.
for a lot of reasons, but I'm a big fan of Lincoln. And I think biographies of Lincoln, of great people. I'm a big fan of Frederick Douglass.
Yes, well, he's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you quote him, I think, at the beginning of a wonderful quote at the beginning of one of your opinions
Yeah.
just a few years ago, I think. Yeah.
I've quoted him in speeches, and I'm a huge fan. I mean, if you want to read a biography, read his.
Yes,
Read
well, that's
it.
a wonderful
Yeah,
autobiography.
and
Yes.
same thing with Lincoln.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Booker T. Washington.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was very popular during my youth, and
Is that right? So he wasn't yet so politically incorrect that you couldn't read him?
political incorrectness.
You didn't care,
doesn't-
but he was
doesn't-
still okay in the 50s.
He
probably
was
himself.
popular.
Yeah.
He was one of the most popular people among blacks in the South.
Yeah. So
And my grandfather, in fact, there were lots of people whose name was Booker T. And there's that great group, Booker T and the MGs.
yeah, right.
It was Booker T. I mean, so
That's a wonderful book, actually. I remember
Yeah.
reading that, teaching that in an American political thought
Yeah.
course. Him and Douglas, I mean, really fantastic.
but they've denigrated
Yeah.
Booker T. Washington. I mean, you still have Tuskegee,
Yeah.
but they've denigrated him and George Washington Carver, people like that we grew up with. But I just think that there are all these people who have actually done things that you see them under attack. They're rewriting them. No one claimed that they were perfect. I was just at Monticello, and I certainly wouldn't claim that Jefferson was perfect. But there are lots of people who aren't.
Right.
But these are people who have done great things, and we should know about them. And we should read about things that they have done as well as what they've said.
I didn't know you took your clerks to Gettysburg. I love Gettysburg myself. I should get there much more often. And I have friends who do staff rides there where they really go over the battle and all that. Are you a student? I mean, do you read?
Oh God, no! I just no.
But you've read some of them. Do you like the Sarna books on Gettysburg and the movie? Did you?
You know what? I've seen the it was Shirer who did.
Not Shirer. I get.
Yeah, he did the Battle Cry. He did the Killer Angels.
Yeah.
And then the wonderful one that they did on the battle in the wilderness over in what was it? General Ghost and.
I don't remember the name. Yeah, this is
Gods and Generals.
Gods and Generals. Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen both. I've seen all of those. But no, I love going. I do not do the day-long things. I have done. I usually like to do 3 or 4 hours, and I go at least once a year.
That's great.
And I love every time I go. I learn something different. I read a lot about it. I've read the Shelby Foote series. And I got into that. I go through these periods. One year it's economics. Another year it's history. It was the Civil War for a while, and Churchill for a number of years, Lincoln for a while. So, but Gettysburg is central. I mean, if the South had won in Gettysburg, I would not be sitting here. This would be a very different country.
Yeah.
And so it's a pivotal moment in our history. And it was a moment where the great contradiction comes ahead. That you have what the Declaration says, you have what the Constitution says, but the great contradiction of slavery. And it's just that contradiction. Look at it, we're still suffering from it. You have the one of the reasons why there were so many of us who thought that Plessy was such a horrible opinion is because it extends the contradiction.
Right.
And and then that goes on till the 20th century. And if you go back and you read what Harlan's saying, he knew. He was the only Southerner who sat on that case.
I did not know
That's
that.
right. He's from Kentucky. Okay? They just go and take a look. He understood what that meant, the implications of it. And look at the long-term implications. What if the court did what, say, the Iowa Supreme Court had done long before that, and just simply said the Constitution knows no color? Let's assume that Harlan's opinion was the majority opinion. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying you would have a perfect world, but you would never have had another almost century of this.
Yeah. Yeah, these things really do matter, right?
It all matters. So you asked me earlier about dissenting. And what if Harlan went along because everybody else went along?
Right.
What if Harlan went along because, well, he couldn't go to the club anymore because people would be after him? What if they started calling him slurs because he didn't go along? What if they say you're an outlier? What if they said that, you're not with the mainstream? Does that make him, the fact that he's an outlier, does that make him wrong? Who was right?
Right.
The court, the majority, or the dissent? And what if there were no dissent by Harlan?
Yeah.
You said you loved the dissent. I loved it. Justice Marshall loved it. It was something to hang on. So maybe it didn't persuade his colleague, but it persuaded history.